The Outer Worlds was once hailed as the spiritual successor to Fallout New Vegas. At least it was during its marketing cycle in 2018. But upon release on October the 25th, 2019, players found the elusive magic that was captured in the joint project between Obsidian Entertainment and Bethesda Game Studios a decade prior to the Outer Worlds release with Fallout New Vegas just wasn't there. But does that mean that the Outer Worlds was a failure? Or is the Outer Worlds a great game that was unfairly overshadowed by nostalgia? Or does it really truly fail to meet the lofty standards set by its predecessor? Now, I can confidently say that playing through this game and trying to answer that question was not on my list of videos I wanted to make in 2025. That was until we got a surprise announcement at the Game Awards that the sequel will be releasing in 2025, which was pretty shocking to me considering that Obsidian is releasing Avowed in February as well. So as I journey through Halcyon, I plan to try and answer the question and look at what we can expect from the sequel later this year. I'll break down the game's strengths, its shortcomings, examining its gameplay, narrative, and design. Along the way, I'll also explore how the DNA of New Vegas manifests in this new IP and where it diverges. This is a retrospective analysis of the Outer Worlds, so this will be the one and only spoiler warning. I will spoil pretty much everything in the game, so this is your chance to click away. Now, the Outer Worlds release in 2019 was largely a success for Obsidian. Reportedly, to date, it has sold over 5 million copies, and that doesn't include it being listed on Game Pass after the fact. I was in fact one of these 5 million copies as I bought the game on release, and I was really excited for a new Obsidian title. I remember playing it, but I don't really remember how I felt about the game. Now, this release date, coupled with the fact that Fallout 76's disastrous release happened around the same time, led to the critical and fan response to the Outer Worlds being mostly positive. But what I have noticed is that over the years, opinion has slowly soured on this game and it's kind of vanished from the face of discourse. It was a really small flash in the pan, so to speak. Now, I think it's very important with anything in life to understand the context of a situation before you begin to judge that specific situation, be that with history or politics or, yes, even game development. So a bit of the context is that the Outer Worlds was developed by Obsidian Entertainment. It is a studio known for crafting super memorable RPGs under more challenging than normal conditions and circumstances, we can say. This game was spearheaded by Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky, and they were the creators of the original Fallout. Many people will know this, but for the ones who don't, Fallout 1 and 2 were actually old school CRPGs released in 1997 and 1998 respectively, featuring the hallmarks of the RPGs of that era, including isometric views, tactical turn-based combat, and pretty in-depth character customization. Now, it's important to make this distinction because over the course of the marketing for the Outer Worlds, it's heavily emphasized that it is directed by the creators of Fallout, but what is conveniently left out is the fact that it was the creators of Fallout 1 and 2, and not the game directors who were responsible for really rocketing Fallout into the mainstream zeitgeist. That was Todd Howard and Bethesda Game Studios, who had purchased the IP from Interplay Entertainment, the studio that Tim and Leonard worked for when creating Fallout, in 2004. The selling of the Fallout IP was in part due to the departure of Kaine and Boyarsky in 2003 when they founded Obsidian Entertainment. Working on Neverwinter Nights and Knights of the Old Republic 2, Obsidian was quickly solidifying itself as a studio with some great talent in the RPG space. But they would truly be catapulted into the conversation with the release of Fallout New Vegas. When Bethesda approached Obsidian to do a spin-off sequel to Fallout 3, Kaine and Boyarsky, along with some other notable developers at Obsidian, such as, and forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong, Fergus Urquhart, Chris Avallone, and Josh Sawyer, jumped at the opportunity. Now, why is all this information important to understand? Well, I think it's vital to know that first and foremost, Obsidian hasn't really been a AAA studio or a big player in the space up until it was purchased by Microsoft in 2018. They have always been a smaller studio that really specialized in some niche RPGs, and with Fallout New Vegas, while they were the only studio really developing the title, it is important to know that they worked in Bethesda's Gamebryo engine, and they had access to technical support from Bethesda and tons of assets from Fallout 3. All of this allowed for a smaller team to make such a big game in such a short amount of time. And the success of Fallout New Vegas didn't really change Obsidian's situation, and at the time of the Outer Worlds development, all of this was still true.
We knew what we wanted the scope to be. We knew we wanted it to be smaller, but as is usually the case, even when we think we're building something smaller, it's bigger than, we've bit off more than we could chew. So we've had to kind of scale back like twice now.
The second thing to note is that there were a few key departures from Obsidian in between the development of New Vegas and the Outer Worlds. one of the largest of note to me being Chris Avallone, who was really the mastermind behind the story and dialogue of New Vegas. Now, a good thing to note here is that Avallone didn't officially leave Obsidian until 2019 and is included on the credits for The Outer Worlds, but he did not have a central role in the writing room as with previous titles. So by the time The Outer Worlds was released, Obsidian was no longer the same studio that had delivered us New Vegas. Key talent had departed, and the team faced the unique challenges of developing an RPG as a smaller AA studio without the resources that they had received from Bethesda. And this is what makes the initial marketing that leaned heavily on the comparisons to New Vegas somewhat dishonest in my opinion. But I will note that as release approached, they tempered those expectations and reiterated that this is not New Vegas 2. But this tempering of expectations was a little too late though, and the hype train had officially left the station. Now, I won't necessarily fault Obsidian for this marketing approach. It is extremely difficult to launch a new franchise from scratch, and anyone in their right mind would leverage such a huge success as New Vegas to drive some sales. They are, after all, a business with employees that they do need to pay. Now, all of this context I've laid out is for us to see that despite the smaller budget and scope, The Outer Worlds aimed to create a compelling new IP for Obsidian, and leveraging the reputation of New Vegas was understandable. But it did set expectations that the game could not always meet. Still, I think it's crucial to evaluate The Outer Worlds on its own terms, while considering the constraints and goals of its creators. But I won't fault anyone for evaluating the game in the shadow of its predecessor. I will even make a few comparisons in this retrospective where I think necessary, but my overall goal of this retrospective is to evaluate the game on its own merits and not what its marketing expectations were. Now, with all that being said, this is my analysis of The Outer Worlds. The game opens with a cutscene that kind of sets the stage for the humor of the game. It very quickly tells you that the game barely takes itself seriously, so you really shouldn't either. You get plucked out of a machine by this goofy mad scientist fellow and are prompted to create your character. Creating your character in The Outer Worlds is a familiar experience for RPG fans, with attributes, skills, and backgrounds shaping your build. However, the system lacks depth and practice, and from the start, one of my biggest issues is that there's truly a lack of distinct builds. You can't really be terrible at anything, and you can excel at almost everything. To start with, you have a list of 6 attributes to adjust at the beginning. They are strength, dexterity, intelligence, perception, charm, and temperament, and they fall under the 3 broader categories of mind, body, and personality. Pretty standard stuff. Here you can start to build out what you excel at and what you aren't so great at, and like I said at the beginning, my first problem is that you really can't be more than below average at anything, really limiting the interesting builds you can make. Now this, coupled with the fact that there aren't that many great bonuses or trade-offs for being really good or below average at any one skill, it makes the most sense to just kind of be good at everything. I personally only took the below average intelligence penalties simply because if you have played an Obsidian game, you know that there are most likely several dialogue options for being a dumb character, and that remains the truth here too. But even the low intelligence build doesn't really create any meaningful drawbacks. I can have a below average intelligence but still master the science, engineering, and medical skills, which kind of locks you into this idiot savant archetype rather than allowing for a more nuanced consequence to being below average intelligence. Now, after you've selected the attributes you excel at and are below average with, you then move on to picking skills to level up with skill points. You start out with a solid pool of points to begin creating your character and your build with, which is something that I really do love and enjoy in these RPGs. And I really do hope that more games bring back this kind of skill point system. But in this instance, it does almost feel as if the developers were scared to let us as the player make a mistake in the creation of our character and our builds. You see, with each skill, they fall under one of the attribute categories. And with the first 50 points of the skills, you can actually just put 1 point into the attribute category, and that levels up all the skills in the category until they reach level 50. And then at that point, the game requires you to specialize more by only allowing you to spend points on the specific skill that you want to level. The problem here though is how the perks of each skill are laid out. You see, at every interval of 20, you unlock a perk related to the skill that you've leveled up, similar to how it works in The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. But here, they have decided to front load each skill's perks, and nearly all of the best perks you can acquire for each skill are at the 40 point threshold. Combining this with the leveling system being XP based and you receiving XP for almost everything you do, meaning that you don't have to use a specific skill to level that skill up, this makes the best possible build really a jack of all trades build. There are very few skills that warrant specializing deep into them. This isn't only where the system sort of fails though. Skill checks and dialogue are too easy as well. Combined with the incentive to simply spread out your points in all the skills, it really undermines the satisfaction of specializing. They do try to address this a bit with the DLCs, making some harder skill checks within them, but overall it just feels as though that they were scared to 1. Let us make mistakes in our builds, and 2. Miss any content because of how we decided to build our characters. And this has been a trend in RPGs for a while now, and I really wish developers would go back to allowing us to specialize in something and letting there be pros and cons to each specialization. Now the last thing to mention in character creation are flaws and perks. There is a perk menu of sorts that you gain a point to spend in every second level, giving bonuses such as improved carry weight and increased movement speed. This is combined with the flaw system, which in theory is really cool. The idea is that if you experience something in the game enough, say taking a lot of plasma damage, the game will offer you a flaw, for example that you become weak to plasma damage after being burned by it too much, and you take 20% more damage from all plasma sources, and in return you receive a point to spend in the perk menu. The issue is, simply, the perk menu is fairly boring and there aren't that many game-changing perks to take, and it doesn't really warrant you taking a flaw that makes you weaker. I only really took 3 flaws for the achievement, but by the mid-game, I had pretty much bought all of the perks I was even slightly interested in and didn't think that any more perks were really necessary. Overall, character building is one of the weaker aspects to the game, especially when you consider the game's difficulty. It's really easy. The normal difficulty means you really don't need to consider stats or gear at all. The hard difficulty is easy as long as you just think a tiny bit of how you want to play and ensure your gear is up to date with your level. Not to mention the companions are very overpowered, but we will cover that a little bit more in depth later. There is a pseudo-hardcore / survival mode called Supernova that introduces sleep, food, and water requirements, and companions can perma-die. You also have very limited fast travel, which isn't that big of a deal considering the skills that you can leverage to augment movement speed, and the size of the map areas are fairly small. I played on Supernova this go around, and I can confidently say that you can put skill points and perks pretty much anywhere and not have that hard of a time. But there are a few very overpowered builds that can break the game entirely, including a stealth build. So if that's something you're interested in, it is an option. One thing to note before I do move on from character creation and character building is, as with many Obsidian games, you can talk your way pretty much out of any situation, and persuasion builds are viable, very viable. It's one of the few builds that can change your playstyle by a bit, but as I stated earlier, you don't really need to invest too heavily into persuasion to pass pretty much every skill check in conversation. Overall, I think that they do have something here, and hopefully in the sequel, better balancing of game difficulty, more thought into skill progression, and a willingness to let the player fail and build a really bad character can really improve upon the foundation that they've laid out here. Now after you've finished with character creation, the game begins on the planet of Terra 2 in the Emerald Vale, where the tone and the mechanics of the Outer Worlds are introduced to us. After a funny cutscene where your character's escape pod crushes the man that was meant to be your guide, which, once again, if you had forgotten that the game is trying to not be taken too seriously, it reminds you again here. You're thrust into a world ruled by corporate interests and greed. The Emerald Vale serves as a microcosm of Halcyon's struggles, a settlement caught between a failing corporate town and the deserters who've abandoned the system entirely. The universe of the Outer Worlds is one of complete and total unfettered capitalism and corporate greed. In the mid-2200s, companies began to buy up the rights to different star systems, and a conglomerate of companies formed the Halcyon Holdings Company and bought the rights to the Halcyon star system. They sent over the first colony ship called the Groundbreaker, full of a bunch of workers for the businesses and companies who had bought the star system, and a few years later, Earth sent a second colony ship called the Hope. Now you were on the Hope in a cryostasis of some kind, but the Hope never arrived at Halcyon. That is, not until 70 years after it was supposed to. Now, the absurdity in which the corporate structure permeates everyone's life is introduced to you with the first character that you meet in a cave, who, even though he is nursing a bullet wound, attempts to give you the company slogan and maligns the fact that he really shouldn't be accepting outside help from somebody who doesn't work for his company, Spacer's Choice.
You've tried the best now. Now try the rest. Spacer's Choice. Oh, wow, that stings.
Now, a lot of people, including myself upon this game's release, thought that this was some sort of long-winded critique of the corporate structure and capitalism's consequences, and the irony being that Obsidian quote-unquote sold out to one of the biggest gaming monopolies in the world, Microsoft, mere months before the game's release. But as I play through this game again, I no longer really think that that was the intention. I don't really think that there's any subliminal messaging here, and I could be wrong, but to me, Halcyon and its corporate structure is just there to serve as an absurd comedic backdrop that, 1, is fairly lighthearted, but 2, allows the writers to get pretty dark when necessary, and I think it was a great choice overall. Anyway, you find Captain Hawthorne's old ship, Captain Hawthorne being your guide that you crushed, and you learn from its AI control system that it needs a new power regulator in order to take off, and that the town nearby called Edgewater has one. Lucky for you. Arriving at Edgewater, you're greeted by a bleak, run-down corporate settlement owned by Spacer's Choice. Smoke is billowing from the Salt Tuna Cannery, which is the factory that keeps the town running, while the weary expressions of its overworked citizens reflect the struggles of corporate life in Halcyon. Inside the factory, you meet Reed Thompson, the town's foreman and Spacer's Choice loyalist. And Reed offers you a deal. You can take the power regulator from the nearby abandoned botanical gardens, but there's a catch. You have to help him first. He explains that a group of deserters has fled town, choosing to live on the outskirts in the actually not so abandoned botanical gardens, and their presence has hurt Edgewater's workforce and strained its already limited resources. Reed tasks you with shutting down the power to the deserters' camp, forcing them to return to Edgewater. Now at the botanical gardens, you'll meet Adelaide McDevitt, the leader of the deserters, and she reveals that she left Edgewater after Reed refused to address the town's worsening conditions, which ultimately led to her son's death. Adelaide has cultivated a thriving community at the botanical gardens, powered by a geothermal plant on the outskirts, and she believes that Edgewater's corporate structure is irredeemable, and she suggests that you divert the power away from Edgewater, effectively dooming the town to ensure her people's survival. Now this isn't the only thing going on in the Emerald Vale. You're also introduced to the first companions of the game, Parvati and Max. Parvati is a shy, optimistic mechanic who really wants to see the world, but she struggles with some self-confidence. And Vicar Max is a vicar of one of the religions in the game who is on this search for this existential truth. They're very different personalities, but they contrast each other kind of perfectly. The companion system in this game allows you to bring up to 2 companions with you, but for the time that you're in Edgewater, even after you complete Max's initial quest so he could join your party, he still refuses to follow you, and you can really only count on Parvati hanging with you and helping you out. Each companion in the game offers a unique ability, skill, and dialogue that they can help you with, and they contribute to combat and can be leveled up, and I will go more in depth into the stories and personalities of the companions and my thoughts on them later in the game, but for now, what's important to know is that during my time in Edgewater, Parvati was really there simply for story background and to increase my carry weight. With the permadeath mechanic of companions in the supernova difficulty, Parvati was way too easily killed in combat at such a low level, and I sidelined her using the system that they have in place to control companions' behavior, which I think was a very well done system for this type of game. There are a few side quests here, but nothing really stands out. Most of the side content in the game, besides a few good exceptions, are simple fetch and kill quests and are completely forgettable. But there is one side quest here in the Emerald Vale that does give you a bit more info on Adelaide and the deserters if you pay close attention. As you approach Edgewater, you meet a gravedigger named Silas. Silas informs you that Spacer's Choice colonies only allow people to rent their grave sites and not actually buy it, and there's a list of people who are behind on their payment. He asks if you could go and collect from them. One of the men you are going to collect from is the barber of Edgewater, whose main responsibility is to actually prepare the bodies for burial and do surgeries on people. Apparently barbers have a lot more to do in Halcyon. He tells you that business right now is terrible and he can't possibly make the payments, but a young man he had recently prepared for burial, who had unfortunately committed suicide, had a set of gold teeth, and perhaps Silas could take those as payment instead of money. When you let Silas know about this development, he lets you know that the young man's body has gone missing and he suspects marauders are looting corpses. The quest ends when you speak to all 4 people, and I don't really think much about it after. That is until I come to the gardens, and behind Adelaide you can see some bloody rags and a plate that has a set of gold teeth on it. This is not a quest, and there is no marker telling you to look here. It is simply something that you find if you look close enough and pay enough attention. If you confront Adelaide about the teeth, she tells you that the soil on the planet is too barren to grow anything and that she uses human corpses for her special fertilizer, and that's what allows her to grow plants here to sustain her community. Parvati is a little taken aback, and it adds just another layer to the decision that you have to make about which group of people you are going to take the power away from. So, after I thoroughly explored and quested through the Emerald Vale, I ended my time here by going to the geothermal factory and making my decision of who I will divert the power away from. Parvati has some last-second advice and states that she doesn't really think it's right to simply punish the people of Edgewater who are just trying to get by and have nothing to do with this feud between Adelaide and Reed. I agree with her and I divert the power away from the gardens. And this is actually a really tough decision for me. There doesn't really feel like a right answer here and I love it, but I do have one issue here. Developers in all RPGs do this, so it's not just Obsidian that I have a gripe with here, but so often when faced with a really tough binary choice that doesn't really seem like there's the right answer to, there is almost always a hidden third option that will allow you to broker some kind of peace and save mostly everybody. In this particular instance, you can actually convince Reed to leave Edgewater, and Adelaide can take over as the leader, and they abandon Spacer's Choice and convert the Saltuna Cannery into a garden. And it's not even that hard to convince Reed to leave Edgewater. You simply have to tell him that Adelaide has figured out how to grow crops, and he admits that he's a bad leader and she would be better at it. I hate this. It is objectively the best outcome, and that's what's so annoying with these kinds of things. I just wish developers would be okay with the player base feeling unsatisfied, even for a second. These hard, morally gray decisions that create tension with the player and make the player invested in the world are so good and so important, and more often than not, they are negated by the ever-present third option. And like I said, Obsidian is not the only developers of RPGs who do this. They are just the subject of this particular video, so right now they are receiving the brunt of my whining. So, anyway, with Adelaide leading Edgewater and a power regulator in my possession, I head back to the ship and my adventure in Halcyon can truly begin. And overall, I think that Edgewater is a good intro to the game, and you can definitely tell that they have front-loaded the game a bit with some of the more interesting aspects of the game that you don't, to be honest, really see later on. For example, the golden teeth thing. There wasn't anything really like that later on in the game that I noticed. Another really good example is the fact that some of the NPCs in the town will actually comment on your armor if you put on some of the armor from the marauders that you kill, which they don't do for the rest of the game. Now, I think in the gaming industry, I'm pretty sure this is called review bait, which is putting some really interesting things and mechanics in the first 5 to 10 hours of the game, so reviewers who don't necessarily play the entire game and focus more on the opening sequences have a more favorable review of the game that doesn't necessarily reflect the rest of the gameplay experience. Now personally, I find this as more of an indictment of the mainstream gaming review media than it is of Obsidian, and I think this sentiment is kind of reflected by the growing distrust of mainstream reviewers. And a lot of the audience is now switching to creators who review games on YouTube, which, if that's you, this is a great time to subscribe to me because I promise that I will play as much of the game as I can before I release a retrospective or a review. Now I have access to the Unreliable, my ship, and central hub for the rest of the game. The Unreliable introduces the hub-based structure, allowing you to travel between locations, store gear, and interact with your growing crew. It also kind of solidifies the episodic design of the game, meaning that each location acts as its own sort of self-contained story, which, to be honest, besides a few exceptions, is my preferred form of RPG storytelling. Open world fatigue is a real thing, and I have it really bad right now. Leaving Emerald Vale, the story directs you to the Groundbreaker, a bustling space station and the first major hub in Halcyon. You're sent here to track down Gladys Kilkelly, a black market broker who holds critical information for progressing your mission. Gladys has access to a nav key, which you need to travel to Monarch, where you can find some critical chemicals required to revive the Hope's colonists. Reviving the colonists is central to Phineas's plan, Phineas being the mad scientist who saved you at the beginning, to save Halcyon from collapse, as he believes that their skills and knowledge are the colony's last chance for survival. Now, the Groundbreaker really stands out to me as a really cool concept of a city, and it reminds me a lot actually of Neon from Starfield, and I wonder if Bethesda had taken a little bit of inspiration from the Groundbreaker when they made that city. The Groundbreaker, if you remember, was the original colony ship sent from Earth, so it is 150 years old at this point, and when they dropped the colonists off, they declared their independence from the corporations, and it's a free, corporate-free, independent hub where any and all people can come and work and live, and there is a corporate presence, but they don't have any control here. This independence does come with its own challenges though, as the station really struggles with a lot of outdated infrastructure and a lot of limited resources due to its refusal to fully submit to corporate authority, and the corporations kind of having monopoly on all the things that they need to keep the ship running. There are a few side quests here that introduce you to a few key characters and factions, but overall, there's nothing too special that I feel like I need to cover right now. When you arrive on the Groundbreaker, you do learn that the cooling system is broken, and everyone complains about how hot it is. So in pursuit of this lead, you meet Junlei Tennyson. Well, I met Junlei Tennyson, whose family has been the head engineer and leader of the Groundbreaker since it arrived in Halcyon. She is tied to Parvati's quest, but we'll cover that later. I volunteered to help fix the cooling system, and after fighting my way through the back bays, kind of like the underbelly of the city, and killing some unemployed people, which is totally acceptable and even encouraged in Halcyon, I fixed the heating and my reputation with the Groundbreaker is improved. And this is actually a great chance to talk about the reputation system. You see, the game features a few factions, such as, for example, Spacer's Choice, or the Board, or Sublight Salvage, the Groundbreaker's crew, or even the Iconoclasts. Each have their own kind of values and priorities, and they all react to your reactions. Completing quests and making decisions, or even siding with certain groups in certain quests, will push your reputation in one way or another with them. And despite the concept of the reputation being kind of integral to shaping the game's world and how others view you, it doesn't feel particularly impactful. And I think there are a couple main factors that contribute to this. The first of these being the ease of high reputation. You see, early in the game, reputation shifts are super forgiving. Even if you make a bad decision for one of the specific factions and the reputation goes down, oftentimes it doesn't go down too much and the consequences are pretty minor. And you can even reset these by special dialogue options sometimes that give you reputation or quest completion rewards. For example, if you fail to meet certain factions' expectations, you can easily resolve the tension through future interactions by choosing a more favorable dialogue option in the future, and it gives you a better reward. And this makes it hard to completely alienate a faction or build a lasting negative standing. And the second thing being a very limited impact it actually does have on the gameplay. In practice, you would think that most NPCs would react to your reputation and their dialogue might change a little bit or their behavior might change a little bit, but not really. The gameplay doesn't significantly evolve based on your reputation level. You don't get these weird hostile reactions to you if you have a really low reputation with a specific faction, and you don't even get these cool, like you would think, exclusive rewards for having a really high reputation with a specific faction. The only thing that you really do get is a discount on the goods that that faction sells. And this really leads to a sense of wasted effort when it comes to like trying to make the right choices based on the faction that you want to align with. And it doesn't really drastically alter the way that I interacted with the world or the world interacted with me. Plus, combining that with the ease of high reputation, by the end of the game, I had max reputation with everybody, even the factions that I was kind of like quote unquote at war with. And there seems to just be this reoccurring theme with a lot of underbaked mechanics that in theory seem impactful and fun on paper, but in practice are relatively pointless. In that same vein of relatively pointless but in theory fun mechanics, I suppose I should also talk about the disguise mechanic, because it's also introduced here on the Groundbreaker. The disguise mechanic is introduced via the holographic shroud, which is a tool that Phineas gives you that allows you to infiltrate these restricted areas by mimicking the appearance of the authorized personnel, i.e. a guard or an engineer. The shroud is automatically equipped once you have it, and it activates automatically once you enter one of these restricted zones, provided that you have an ID cartridge that's specific to that zone or area. And these cartridges can be found all over. You can find them in back rooms exploring, you can buy them from black market dealers, even certain quests will give you the specific ID cartridge you need. Now, once the disguise is active, you have like a countdown bar at the bottom that slowly drains based on the kind of movements that you make. It drains faster if you sprint, and it drains slower if you walk, but in reality, it drains at the same pace because if you're sprinting, you're covering more ground, so it's like the same amount of distance moved. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but it's fine. But then there's also a suspicion meter that each of the individual guards have, and you can see that above their head. It's like a little triangle that slowly fills up, and if that triangle fills all the way up, they'll confront you. Or if your timer of your shroud runs all the way out, the shroud will come off, and then the suspicion meter will automatically fill up if anybody actually sees you, and they'll confront you. Once they confront you, then you have the option of making a dialogue check via lying, persuading, or intimidating, and if you pass that dialogue check, you'll refill your shroud's timer and you'll be able to continue on your way. And you have 3 lives basically with this shroud's timer. And now, while this disguise mechanic is a kind of like a fresh addition to the game systems and it kind of changes up how you can do some stuff, like a lot of the other systems in this game, its implementation it's just way too easy to use. NPCs rarely pursue their suspicions aggressively. The skill checks to defuse the confrontations are super forgiving and super easy, and that said, the system adds not very much variety to the gameplay, really just offering a stealthier alternative to just shooting up the entire place whenever you want to go in somewhere. And it also kind of negates the actual stealth skill, so instead of just trying to sneak around, you're now using the holographic shroud instead. And I can say that in all the hours that I played, I never once failed a speech check or had any real scary issues with the disguise mechanic. So similar to the reputation system, the disguise mechanic kind of just feels underbaked. Like it was a good idea on paper, but in practice, it's just not really that interesting at all. At least not to me. But anyway, the last thing that I did do of note before I went to see Gladys on the Groundbreaker was help this girl named Edna Ingmeyer. She's the communications officer of the Groundbreaker, and she asked me to fix their relay station, which had gone dark. Now, I felt like this quest is important to mention simply because on the surface, it is a simple fetch quest. But the terminals and journals that you find and read at the station do such a good job of countering this overly funny and jokey tone that the game has had so far, and it adds some serious darkness to this world. Basically, when you arrive at the space station, you find that the station has been taken over by a man named Frey from Byzantium, which is like the main capital. He's been hearing these voices in his head telling him to kill people, including his old supervisor at his old job. So he fled here with supplies to try and silence the voices and live here alone so he couldn't hurt anyone, and in doing so, he disconnects the relay from the Groundbreaker to stop the incoming transmissions to try and stop the voices. That unfortunately does not stop the voices, and he ultimately commits suicide, and you can come across his body as you make your way to the terminal to reconnect the relay to the Groundbreaker. It can go completely unnoticed if you don't read the journal entries and pay attention and just follow the objective markers on the compass to where you need to go and do what you need to do. But it's stuff like this that just makes games feel so much more fleshed out and alive to me, and I really appreciate the detail that they added to this little, what could have just been written off as a really fast fetch quest where you have to kill some robots, connect a terminal, and then walk away. But after successfully faffing about on the Groundbreaker for a few hours, I met with Phineas's contact Gladys to obtain the nav key to Stellar Bay on Monarch. Stellar Bay is currently being blockaded by the board and people aren't allowed to land there, so that's why I'm going through a black market channel to obtain a nav key that will allow my ship's AI to land on the planet. Gladys, the nice old lady that she looks like, is actually a ruthless negotiator, and she says that I need to pay 10,000 credits to get my hands on that key, and I am broke as hell. But she has a job for me that can help me pay for the key. She has received information on a distress signal being sent from a corporate research station called the Roseway, and tells me that I should go there under the guise of somebody wanting to help out, and she will pay me for any and all top secret info I can steal while I'm there. So, next stop, the Roseway. Now the Roseway is this corporate outpost that's kind of mired in secrecy. The Roseway's aesthetic is abandoned labs and corporate decay, and it sets like a much darker tone than the previous locations I had visited up until this point. I mean, you were met with dead bodies and broken machinery littering the streets as you make your way from the landing pad to the settlement. So we arrive and find Auntie Cleo's outpost, and Auntie Cleo's outpost, as Auntie Cleo is one of the corporations, and we are directed to speak with the lead researcher here, Anton Crane. He says that he did send the distress signal, but he overreacted and sent it too soon. But he's glad to take your help anyway. He tells you about a secret laboratory that was attacked by marauders, and when it was attacked by the marauders, the rats, which are big lizards in this game, that they were testing on escaped. This, plus the marauders, caused them to have to abandon the lab and take refuge in the settlement. He asks you to go take care of the rats by either killing or putting them to sleep with the ventilation system and a special gas that puts them to sleep, and to also take care of the marauders and recover his research, which he is very sheepish about disclosing. This is one of the 3 pieces of information we can sell to Gladys, but there are 2 others. One scientist was secretly harvesting a drug from the rats and selling it, and he asks you to finish harvesting the drug and wipe the research from the terminal. And then the 3rd scientist tells you about a schematic for a weapon that the colony has outlawed and asks you to retrieve it for him. These 3 things can be sold to Gladys or given to the scientists for their own reward. The abandoned lab is interesting, and there are several ways of taking care of the marauders and rats, including a peaceful and a deadly way. What's interesting is that this is the first time that my low intelligence actually affects my gameplay to a very serious extent. When I go to attempt to harvest the rest of the drugs and wipe the terminal for the one scientist, I'm too dumb to figure it out and I can only just push some buttons and end up breaking the terminal, and this locks me out of selling that research to Gladys. So now I only have two options. The weapon schematic I decided to give back to the scientist to gain a pretty solid pistol that was a great upgrade for me for a while, and these two things basically locked me into selling Anton's research to Gladys instead of returning it. Now, what was Anton's research, you might want to be asking? The reason this secret laboratory in the middle of nowhere was operating? The work Anton does that is so vital to the survival of the colony as he iterates over and over? Well, it was diet toothpaste. Again, this is the comedic subversion that we've kind of come to expect, but like I said, it is a bit heavy-handed, and I think the style of comedy that Obsidian is going for is better served as comedic relief in a darker situation and not the entire plot, if that makes any sense. That's not to say there aren't funny lines in this game, and they do a good job in a few other instances, and there's been a couple times where I really cracked up, but just here I think it's a little bit too much. Now, the diet toothpaste does also actually have an importance to the main story, and we learn more about that later, but still, I think it could have been anything but diet toothpaste just for the laugh. In any case, I had no choice but to keep the research in order to pay for the nav key from Gladys, so to Anton's disappointment, I lied to him and told him that the research wasn't there, and he laments that he will now be stuck in the backwater forever and never get that promotion he wants so desperately. But with the toothpaste research in hand, I head back to the Groundbreaker and I buy the nav key to Monarch. And with the nav key in hand, you would think I would head straight to Monarch to meet with Phineas's contact to learn more about these chemicals, but there's one other thing I wanted to do. You see, there is a contact for the board stationed on the Groundbreaker, and he gives me the opportunity to betray Phineas and take the bounty that the board has on Phineas's head. And I wanted to see how far I could play both sides, so I sold Phineas out, much to the chagrin of Felix. Felix being a new member of my crew that I recruited while I was on the Groundbreaker. See, on the Groundbreaker, I kind of forgot to mention you can recruit 2 more people to your crew, Felix and Ellie. And like I said, I'm going to go pretty in depth on the companions at a different part of the video, but it's good to know at this point in the game I had now 4 people in my crew, Parvati, Max, Felix, and Ellie. Anyway, much to the chagrin of Felix, I've sold Phineas out and now I've gained access to Byzantium to go speak with the board. Byzantium is the gleaming capital of the board's power, and at first glance, Byzantium is this opulent city with its gold-plated architecture and marbled interiors. However, the cracks in its facade soon become super apparent. Piles of trash, boarded up shops, and a pervasive sense of decay are noticed the longer you wander around. I love this. It's such a small detail, but it does so much to foreshadow the problems facing the colony and the board and the gilded age that they are living in slowly eroding. So I have a meeting with the adjutant of the board, Sophia Akande. She tells me that she wants to accept the tip about Phineas, but I need to prove that she can trust me first, of course. She tells me to take out a cartographer who is mapping the colony for reasons that she won't disclose. By take out, I mean murder. But apparently there is also another assassin that was hired and has failed to do the task, and I should keep an eye out for him as well. Well, I find the assassin, and he gives me the info that I need to find the cartographer, and when I confront the cartographer, the assassin actually shows up, asks me to split the contract, and I tell him to buzz off and I'm going to take care of it because I did all the work. I decided originally to let this lady live, but at the last second, I decided it would be best to eliminate her in case somehow letting her live wouldn't let me progress further on the board's side, and I was actually right. Akande informs me that she was watching me the whole time and that I passed the test. She then gives me a bug to plant in Phineas's computer to allow the board to track and find him, and I accept it. Again, Felix is very unhappy about this. He's pretty anti-board. But I will discuss his development and ideals in a separate section, like I've reiterated. So I head to Phineas's secret lab, and instead of planting the bug, I actually inform him of what I've done, and he's actually excited. He tells me to corrupt the bug and plant it in the computer, buying him more time because it's already an inevitability that the board will find him, so this helps me get closer to the board and it buys him some time. So, returning to Akande, she thanks me and then gives me another job to go to Monarch and stop the broadcasting in a radio tower that is broadcasting this anti-board propaganda, which, coincidentally, is also where Phineas's contact is, who has the information on the chemicals. So both paths of the main quests converge in this spot, whether you're on the board side or Phineas's side. Other than that, I will say that Byzantium has the most interesting side quests of the game. in part due to the fact that there aren't many options for combat, so most of them are just interesting dialogue-based quests, which is where I think Obsidian really shines. It's like some of the quests are really funny, like becoming a movie star, and whenever you're going to your audition, you have live weapons, and one of the options is to actually just kill all of the extras, and if you do that, the director loves it, and you become a movie star, and everybody refers to you as a movie star in the game, which I think is hilarious. You can also model clothes for fashion clothier. And Byzantium is really up there with one of my favorite zones of the game so far, but with all roads converging on Monarch, I go ahead and head to Stellar Bay. Now, I feel like Monarch represents like the narrative and mechanical heart of this game, The Outer Worlds, and by mechanical, I mean like gameplay mechanics. It's the largest and most open environment of the game, and it offers like a really good mix of wilderness and cities, because in most of the other areas, there's only one settlement/city you can visit, and then there's wilderness on the outside. But Monarch actually has 3 settlements and an abandoned settlement that are connected by wilderness that you have to traverse. Monarch has 2 major factions vying for control. You have the MSI and the Iconoclasts. They embody super contrasting philosophies. The MSI, led by Sanjar Nandi, is a reformist corporate faction attempting to kind of like improve worker conditions while maintaining productivity. And the Iconoclasts are led by a man named Graham Bryant, and he is like a revolutionary seeking to dismantle corporate control entirely. Also here in Stellar Bay on Monarch, we find Nyoka, our final recruitable companion, and she joins our crew here. She is a contact that Phineas had and is going to be our guide on Monarch while we're here, and she's going to help us get to the radio tower. Now, Monarch's vast wilderness is both its strength and its weakness, in my opinion, and what do I mean by that? I mean, basically this. The landscapes are very, very cool looking, and it's beautifully designed, and I love the art style, but the gameplay just kind of sucks here. I mean, there's this thing in this game with the enemy respawns where you have specific groups of enemies in specific spots, and whenever they respawn after a certain amount of in-game time that I wasn't really quite able to figure out how long it was, they respawn in that same exact fixed location in the same exact kind of fixed position. And it is just a really, really static feeling. And the exploration also is really, really rewarded. I mean, players don't really find any significant discoveries in Monarch. Like, I wandered around for a long time and I didn't really find anything that cool. I mean, the points of interest are almost exclusively tied to quests, which really diminishes that sense of like, ooh, what's around this corner? Maybe I'll find something that's not necessarily a quest marker, but has something interesting that I can learn about. Kind of similar to what I was talking about with the whole gold teeth thing in the Emerald Vale. And here, I think, is a great spot to discuss combat because you will be fighting a lot of things on Monarch. And it's also kind of like the mid-game, so the real variety of different builds and weapons are opened up to you. And compared to the early game where you're really stuck with just a few options, I think this is a much better place to like analyze and talk about the combat and how it works. Now, judging these sort of games' combat super harshly will always detract from your enjoyment of these games, in my opinion. Games like Oblivion, Skyrim, all the Fallouts, they all have this kind of janky but serviceable combat that's kind of just a vehicle to deliver you the story and give you something to do when you're, questing, right? And personally, when I'm playing RPGs like this, that's all I really need. I don't need the best combat and the most responsive and great feeling gunplay. And you won't find the Outer Worlds really straying very far off of that course. The gunplay in this game is very average. It feels just fine, if not maybe a little bit slow and sluggish. Now, there are 3 categories of guns. You have long guns, heavy guns, and pistols, and you can specialize in any of these with skill points, increasing your damage with them. And then there are subcategories of damage types that the guns can do, and specific enemies are resistant to certain types and vulnerable to others. So that's like a little bit of spice added onto the combat where you can go a little bit more in depth. But like I said, the game is very easy and you don't really need to think about this too much. Anyway, the subtypes are corrosive damage, physical damage, plasma damage, electrical damage, and the most interesting one to me was the in-ray damage. They all do what you would assume, but the in-ray is kind of interesting because it's a damage over time effect that also spreads from enemy to enemy if they're close enough together. So that's kind of like the one interesting thing. Everything else is just a different colored bullet that does a different kind of damage, kind of. Now, I personally really enjoyed using snipers and the plasma carbine. That has kind of like a charge up effect. And there are also melee weapons, one-handed and two-handed, that you can use, but I didn't really use a ton in any of my playthroughs because it's just like if you've used melee in any Fallout game, it's pretty much what you can expect here in the Outer Worlds. Now, the interesting twist, so to speak, that the Outer Worlds does is the science weapons. This is kind of how they change up the combat a bit. And the base game has 5 science weapons, and then the DLCs add 6 more, and they're like these different kind of weapons that add a little special effect and a little wackiness to the game. I kind of equate them to a little bit like the Daedric artifacts in the Elder Scrolls series. The Shrink Ray, the Gloop Gun, and the Mind Control Gun are my favorite and most interesting ones to use from the base game. There's also like a hammer and a baton that you can get, but I didn't really use them that much. The Shrink Ray literally shrinks your foes and makes them weaker to damage. The Gloop Gun like turns off gravity and sends enemies ragdolling, and it's really funny. And the Mind Control Gun takes an enemy and makes it your ally. And they're all really interesting and fun to use. I will say that the Murder on Eridanos DLC adds the most overpowered weapon in the game, the Spectrum Gatling Gun, and it trivializes the entire game, but it is really fun to use. And, you know, I think just adding even more of these wacky science weapons, not necessarily making them overpowered, but just some new, fun, crazy flavor to the combat would suit this game and its sequel. It's already fairly easy, and adding a little chaos to the combat would just keep it a little bit more engaging than just simply shooting people, point, shoot, and they die instantly. Then there's also the tactical time dilation, which is just a different version of VATS. What I do like about it is the ability to gain a little bit more info on the enemies when using the TTD, but otherwise it's basically VATS from Fallout, and there isn't much I feel like I could say that most everybody doesn't already know. Simply put, you can pause time and gain a little bit more info and target weak spots of an enemy, and the more you shoot or the more you move, the faster your little TTD meter drains and then time speeds back up again. The enemy AI and enemy variety, unfortunately, is the weakest part of the combat in my opinion though. And variety is a really strong word I'm using here because there isn't any. You basically have humans, space dogs, space monkeys, space lizards, giant praying mantises, and robots that you fight some flavor of for the entire 20 to 40 hours that you're playing the game. The AI is also not great. The melee enemies will just sprint right at you and then get mowed down by you, and the ranged enemies mostly just stand there out in the open and only occasionally will run for some cover. And by the end of the game, I had invested pretty heavily in a stealth build, and I also had this super overpowered sniper rifle, which was pretty much just one-tapping everything with the stealth bonus damage, which honestly was fine, as I found the combat started to not really be particularly engaging, and I was kind of just trying to get through it to get to the next part of the story. The biggest aspect of your combat power actually does come from the itemization. Like I said, I had a super overpowered sniper rifle, and that's kind of how the game works. It doesn't really matter your skills in this particular weapon, because as long as the weapon is leveled to your specific level, it does enough damage to pretty much annihilate anything, even on the hardest difficulty. Unfortunately, also, a lot of the armor, when we're talking about the itemization, is super samey. It's just a different color to reflect the different corporations and factions that wear it, but it's kind of the same. There's 3 basic light, medium, and heavy armors, and then you have a little bit of uniqueness, but there's not really any cool, like, legendary armors that you can find. So unfortunately, I wasn't really paying that much attention to the armor, and I really just found myself looking for any of the armor that could give me the biggest bonus to either a skill that I hadn't really invested in to help me out a little bit, or the highest armor rating I could find to mitigate a bit of damage. Which kind of sucks because there are these weird legendary armors that have these little bonuses, but none of them are really that great, and they're kind of like legendary variants of the same armor, so they don't even really look that different. There are really only like 5 or 6 really unique pieces of armor, which kind of bums me out because I really enjoy these games and finding like a legendary weapon. Like the science weapons are really cool because it's this very, very unique, cool, powerful thing that you can get, and the fact that there wasn't an armor equivalent kind of bummed me out. But honestly, the biggest thing that you need to do to just keep your power level up in the game and continue to be able to kill enemies quickly is to tinker with your guns, which is basically, tinker is the word for leveling them up. This and adding some of the mods that you can find to your armor will keep you sufficiently strong enough to not really have any problems with any enemies in the game, especially when you're also leveraging the companions and their abilities. But outside the combat and character power level and itemization, and returning back to Monarch's main story, it kind of revolves around resolving the conflict between the MSI and the Iconoclasts. You see, Sanjar Nandi, MSI's leader, is a pragmatic but kind of flawed guy who's kind of clinging to this idea that corporations can be reformed from within. Graham Bryant, the Iconoclast leader, is kind of a preacher preaching liberation, but he's also hiding some pretty dark stuff. It isn't just MSI and the Iconoclasts on Monarch though. There is also a small smuggling den where the wealthy from Byzantium come to indulge in the more baser vices people have, and it's led by one of the higher-ups with Sublight Salvage, one of the bigger factions in the game, and their side quests actually shed a bit of light on the twist at the end of the game. There are a few quests you can do with Sublight here on Monarch, including stealing a large amount of special gas in another abandoned lab, and taking over a Borst factory with a psychopathic owner who is actually killing and eating people. You know, this game is funny, but it does get really dark sometimes. These are both really good quests, but the one quest I wanted to highlight actually is a very, very basic fetch quest. There is a man in Fallbrook who is smuggling drugs and decided to use small sprats to transport his drugs. Unfortunately, and not unexpectedly, these sprats, which is like this game's version of rats, had failed to deliver, and he wanted me to investigate why. So I go into the drug smuggling cave and I find dead sprats and return, and literally the only reason that I wanted to highlight this quest is for this sequence right here.
This is only half! You think you can steal from me? Ow! Damn it, that hurt like the blazes. Okay, all right. You didn't take it. But someone did. Search Fallbrook. Either half the sprats got loose on their own, or there'll be some evidence
I mean, I haven't laughed this hard at a game in a while, and this may just be an indictment to my sense of humor, but this was so funny to me, and it just sticks out in my brain as Obsidian's humor landing perfectly, just smacking this guy around. But I really should discuss the Sublight Salvage plotline, as it is important to the story, even though there is not nearly enough punching of bowler hat wearing mustached weirdos. So there are a few quests strung together in a row for Sublight in a chain, and they're given to you from the leader of Sublight, who has an office on the Groundbreaker named Lilia Hagen. The first one I already mentioned. It's to salvage gas called Alta Vitae from the abandoned secret lab on Monarch. In this lab, you learn that they are using the gas to experiment on something, but you're unsure of what. After returning to Lilia, she then sends you to salvage an abandoned research space station by connecting it to Sublight's network and effectively claiming it for Sublight by corporate law. Somehow this is like the way the corporate law works is if Sublight plants its flag in the network there, it's theirs now. In this station, you find people suspended in a liquid being experimented on, and it was related to the Alta Vitae gas. Alta Vitae? I'm never going to get that right. Returning to Lilia, she informs you that while yes, you have been helping Sublight, she has had a secret ulterior motive to the mission she's given you. She informs you that she believes that the board is covering up aliens and alien interference in the colony, and she sends you to Byzantium to find the scientist who she thinks is experimenting on these people under the board's supervision to help these aliens that are slowly infesting the colony. All of this leads you to finding and confronting the scientist, who informs you that no, there are no aliens, but there is in fact a large existential crisis facing the colony. Human bodies are unable to derive enough nutrients from the food in Halcyon, and the entire population of Halcyon is slowly starving to death. And you can actually see this in Edgewater, when there is a constant talk of a plague that's killing people, and the plague is somehow miraculously cured by Adelaide's vegetables. It's because they aren't actually plagued, they are just malnourished. The scientist informs us that she was experimenting on her own colleagues trying to change the human DNA to adapt better to Halcyon's living conditions, but has been unsuccessful so far. The board has made this a high priority project, indicating that they know of the crisis, and this is one of the steps that they are taking to try and solve it. I have a choice now of either killing the scientist like Lilia wants, or forcing her to work with Phineas or the board. I choose to send her to work with Phineas, which she agrees to simply because she thinks that the crisis is far too important to not be dealt with, and she will do whatever it takes to keep trying to solve this situation. This, of course, pisses Lilia off, as she doesn't believe me when I tell her that there are in fact no aliens, and she begins to actually suspect that I have been corrupted by the aliens as well, and essentially excommunicates me from Sublight and threatens to kill me if I show my face there ever again. And overall, I think that the Sublight plotline and the Sublight side quests were some of the better side quests in the game, and I do appreciate the fact that like a totally missable section of the game, like some side quests that people might not interact with, provides some great detail into the main quest, and it kind of really rewards those people who engaged with all of the content. So yeah, the Sublight side quest was really cool. I think the ending was a little weird, the fact that she refused to believe you about the aliens, but it is what it is, I suppose. So back to Monarch though, it is time to finally meet up with Phineas's contact, who coincidentally is also the one broadcasting the illegal anti-board propaganda we need to shut down. We learn that the information broker, as he likes to be called, does indeed know where we can find the chemicals required to revive the Hope's colonists, but before he tells us, we need to fix a problem for him. Classic. MSI and the Iconoclasts are the ones hijacking his radio tower and broadcasting these messages in some sort of recruitment war against each other, and the information broker wants them to both stop. Coincidentally, this is also what we need to do to stop them from broadcasting this illegal propaganda that Akande wants to be rid of. So, we have to resolve the issues with the MSI and the Iconoclasts. So as I mentioned earlier, these two factions are diametrically opposed to one another. But the two leaders actually used to be friends and colleagues. Before the board and other companies began to abandon Monarch because it became too dangerous to actually live and work on, there was a company known as Monarch Stellar Industries, or MSI. Both Sanjar and Graham worked for Monarch Stellar Industries, and in the wake of the abandonment of Monarch, they hatched a plan to leverage an obscure law in the books of the board to claim the entire planet for MSI, thus strengthening their position in Halcyon. But the bosses of MSI did not approve of this, and tragically and coincidentally, most of the upper management and bosses were actually killed in a pirate raid on a settlement outside of Stellar Bay called Amber Heights, where the Iconoclasts currently hide out. So that gave Sanjar and Graham the ability to take over MSI, as they were like the next highest ranking officials, and they began to enact their plan to take over Monarch for MSI. But Sanjar and Graham began to drift apart, and ultimately Graham left over the philosophical differences in how they wanted to lead the settlement, and he started the Iconoclasts, a radical religious group who wanted to be completely free from the board's influence, while Sanjar still wants to partake in the economy and governing of the board and the colony. But he wants to reform how the workers are treated by giving them a 40-hour work week and weekends off. Truly a revolutionary. So in order for me to stop their broadcasts, I need to solve both factions' issues, including getting some documents for Sanjar and then some supplies for the Iconoclasts. What I learn as I work with both factions is that Sanjar wants to leverage another very obscure law to reintegrate MSI with the board and eventually take a very important role on the board, with the idea that he can reform the board from the inside out. While Graham, on the other hand, wants to just simply get his message out and start recruiting more people to his cause for an eventual invasion of Stellar Bay to take it from MSI and have a home for his people. One important thing to note is that while helping the Iconoclasts, Graham's second-in-command, Zora, has some worries about Graham and asks you to find some information from before everything happened with him and Sanjar. You learn that it was actually Graham, in fact, who gave the pirates the ability to attack the upper management of MSI, and it led to their deaths in his attempt to free MSI from Monarch and the board's control. Zora is outraged by this development, but she tells me we need to wait and see before she decides what she's going to do with this information. Ultimately, after solving both factions' problems, they agree to stop broadcasting and I can return to the information broker. He gives me the info I need for Phineas, and I also, before I leave, threaten him into working with the board and using his radio tower for the board's sake. Now, as I go to leave the radio tower, the warship in Monarch's atmosphere that is responsible for holding the embargo the board has placed on Monarch. By the way, they placed the embargo on Monarch because of what Sanjar did with MSI and taking control of the entire planet. It comes crashing down, the warship that is, out of the sky, and then Sanjar and Graham both contact me and urge me to recover the targeting module for its guns for them so that they could use the guns on the ship against one another. And so far, this is a super intriguing plotline to me. I really enjoy both leaders of both factions. They're very interesting and I'm super engaged. I love the friction that they have with each other, being old friends and now bitter enemies, and it's all just really engaging. But the decision-making process here on Monarch mirrors Emerald Vale almost exactly. You can side with either faction outright, or if you help Zora find out the truth about Graham, you can then overthrow Graham and Zora becomes the leader of the Iconoclasts, and agrees if you can convince her to work with Sanjar and the two factions can come together. Now, even though this game is super goofy and funny and it doesn't really take itself too seriously, there are some really well written and well voice acted moments that can deliver an emotional punch to your gut, and I feel like when Zora is overthrowing Graham, it's one of those.
You've brought me as far as you can down the eternal path. It's time to step down.
The troops. Listen to you. This isn't an army. They aren't soldiers. They're believers. Followers. They pick up a gun because you tell them to, not because they want to. And you, Captain, after all you've done for me, for us, you throw behind this mutinous blasphemer? How can you say that, after all I've done for the Iconoclasts? They wouldn't be here without me. I built this movement from the ground up. I've brought freedom to Monarch, and all these years later, we're still free.
I joined because I believed that you were in it for the Iconoclasts. That you wanted nothing more than to bring freedom to Halcyon. That you were selfless. But I know the truth now, Graham. I know what happened in Amber Heights. You didn't start this movement because you wanted to save us. You wanted to save yourself.
No.
This third option requires more effort but results in a mutually beneficial resolution. And the repetitive nature of this structure begins to wear me thin at this point in the game. The choices are starting to feel super formulaic, and the hidden best outcome undermines the weight of the decisions for me, and unfortunately, it isn't the last time this will happen in this game. And after uniting them, I can say goodbye to Monarch, and now I have moved into the final act of the game, so to speak. Monarch overall was interesting. Like all of the areas in the game, the design and art style really appeal to me, but it does get fairly repetitive. With the lack of ability to fast travel in the supernova difficulty, and like I mentioned, the early enemies being static and in the same spot on the map and sort of on this weird respawn timer, it just made everything so predictable and boring outside of the actual quest content. I think the game would have really benefited from much more of a linear gameplay loop than what we have now. These open world style areas don't really add anything to the game and they become very tedious and repetitive rather quickly, in my opinion at least. But before I do move on to the final act of the game, there's a few other things I need to cover, which sounds insane to me considering I am currently on the 23rd page of this script, but hell, I've already gotten this far, so let's keep it rolling. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the companions now, and the reason I'm talking about the companions so late into the video is simply because we finally recruit our last companion when we get to Monarch, and it just felt natural in the flow of things to discuss the companions after I was done discussing Monarch because that was when we had the full roster. So the Outer Worlds features 6 companions. Each have their own unique personalities, abilities, and quests. Companions are a great addition to the game, and the cast we have that join us all kind of fill their own niche and add to the whole ragtag group of troublemakers vibe that the game has going. Mechanically, companions are fairly simple, but they are extremely overpowered. They have no weapon or combat style or armor preferences, which basically means that you can just stick them in the absolute heaviest armor you can find to increase their defense and give them either one of the science weapons that weakens enemies like I did, or a massive Gatling gun that melts the enemies. I can see how on a difficulty that doesn't have permadeath for them, they could be unstoppable, but you do have to be a little bit more strategic on how and when you use them in supernova difficulty, as even with great armor and upgraded health, they are still very squishy and die very easily. The most overpowered aspect of them though by far is their special abilities, but not for the reason that you're thinking. The main reason is that it stops time and stops your character from receiving any damage while they perform this unskippable cutscene. So leveraging this when you get into a really tight situation to give yourself a break and get an enemy to stop hurting you basically allows you to have 2 separate oh shit buttons. Combining this with the tactical time dilation makes almost any encounter trivial. Each companion also has a specific skill that they augment for you. For example, Max augments your hacking ability and Felix augments your persuasion ability. This is the real reason to bring the companions along, and it also makes a lone wolf style build almost always objectively worse than taking your companions with you. Because yes, while there are perks that can increase your skills and stats while you're alone, there are also perks that, for example, double the bonus the companion can give you, which is much better than any of the bonuses you can take when playing a non-companion build. As for their personalities, each companion has their own thing going for them, and they all have their one quest line that helps you learn a bit about them and develops their character further. Parvati is this shy but still kind of optimistic mechanic who was desperate to leave Edgewater and kind of explore the universe, or at least Halcyon. Her personal quest revolves around her budding feelings for Junlei, the Groundbreaker's chief engineer, and honestly, I think that this quest is kind of cute, and I don't really have any problems with it, even though it's not mechanically intensive or, filled with any great revelations of the character or anything going on with that. It's just simply giving Parvati the courage to be herself and plan a date with Junlei. But it does really give her personality a chance to shine, and it really allows the character to find herself. One thing to note about Parvati also is that she's asexual, meaning that she doesn't really feel a desire or a need for physical touch in a relationship. And honestly, I think this kind of inclusivity is done so well, because one, it's not really a well-represented sexuality. I don't really ever remember playing any games or really watching that many films or TV shows where asexual people are represented, but also because this representation isn't just ham-fisted into the game with no reason. Her asexuality really kind of coincides with her nervousness that people, especially Junlei, won't accept her for who she is. Parvati is just a really sweet character that always leans towards whatever decisions will help the most people and hurt the least amount of people, and honestly, she's one of my favorite characters in the game.
I told her how we got Mr. Raymond to bake it for us, so it was double authentic. Made by a real live Monarch person.
Max, on the other hand, is a vicar, searching for existential truth. Max's quest delves into the philosophies of the game's religious factions, the Philosophists and the OSI, and it gives you a chance to really learn about them and kind of build out the lore of the game. His entire personality and quest in the beginning is centered around his hunt for the truth to the grand equation that the architect of the universe has set in motion that guides everything along the Great Plan. Now that is a pretty large lore dump, but basically his religion is based on a predetermination worldview, and the opposing and outlawed worldview of the Philosophists is one of self-freedom and governance, self-governance, which doesn't really fit into the board's idea of a productive person's belief system, so it is outlawed, while OSI is the main religion of the colony. His search for the truth leads us to a hermit on an abandoned mining asteroid that gets us high, and Max has a conversation with his dead mother, which, weirdly, I can also see and converse with. Ultimately, this leads him to converting to philosophism and realizing that his constant search for the truth was blinding him to what was in front of him. Max's arc is one of the more introspective and lore-rich companion arcs of the game, and his serious kind of demeanor really contrasts with the game's humor, and it does offer kind of a refreshing change of pace whenever he weighs in on certain situations.
You want me to give up my discipline? My control? Oh, but I can't. Without order, there is chaos.
And then you have Ellie, who you recruit on the Groundbreaker. Ellie is this rebellious pirate medic with a super sharp tongue. And to me, Ellie is the most shallow character of the game, but that doesn't mean I don't like her. She has a very basic character arc of maybe being a loner isn't everything and friends are a good thing, which is fine, but yeah, there isn't a whole lot of depth to her. She seems almost a bit childish, and almost all of her decisions stem from wanting to stick it to her parents. For valid reasons, as they are legitimately awful parents. Her quest is about how after Ellie left home, her parents faked her death to claim the insurance payouts, and when Ellie goes back to confront them, they don't even care, and they're more interested in convincing Ellie to leave before anybody notices and messes up their insurance payments, even though they haven't seen Ellie in years. So, understandably, Ellie decides to get back at them, and she claims the insurance for herself, and that's it. That's pretty much her entire quest. Meeting her parents and committing insurance fraud. It is sad that there isn't much more growth for her, but not every story has to be a perfect ending, and she is funny, and I found myself traveling with her a fair bit throughout the game.
don't have to get all mushy about it. Still, maybe you've got a point. Maybe it's good to watch someone's back now and then so that one day they watch yours.
The other companion you can recruit on the Groundbreaker is Felix. Felix is the young and dumb revolutionary, the rebel without a cause, if you will. You meet him on the loading dock of the Groundbreaker, and he tells you he was recently fired as a box loader for punching his boss. He really doesn't appreciate authority that takes advantage of people, and is one of the only companions who actually has an issue with you siding with the board. He will even leave your party if you follow the board path all the way to its end. His quest, though, is one of the most interesting ones to me, in my opinion. He is contacted by his old mentor Harlow, who was kind of the one who instilled in him this desire to fight the power and lead a revolution. And when I meet him, he tells me and Felix that he's starting the revolution now, and the outlaws around him on this asteroid secret base are the first part of it. His plan isn't to overthrow the board, but to outlast them, and when they are weak, take advantage of that weakness and carve out a part of the colony where he can live free with his outlaws. Felix loves this idea. Harlow tells me and Felix about a traitor and asks us to go take care of him, and if we do, Felix can join his gang. We then learn from the traitor that the reason he betrayed Harlow was because he was taking jobs from the board to kill and rob people in Halcyon. Felix is understandably upset, as this is the ultimate betrayal to him. What I love about this quest isn't that Harlow is just a straight up bad guy, but more of the fact that he had to sell out to the board to keep his group supplied while they bide their time. It was the pragmatic choice, and even if he hates the board and what they stand for, he couldn't see any other way of sustaining his revolution without the board's resources. Felix has the choice then to join Harlow or to stay with me. But what I don't like here is that he will only join Harlow if I push him into it. I think they set up a great opportunity here for you to see the consequences of your actions if you have repeatedly sided with the board over Felix's wishes, and it's here he decides to abandon the crew. But that's not exactly what happens. Overall, while I think Felix's actual character isn't my favorite, his quest is up there with one of the more interesting ones.
It's pretty harsh, boss. You including yourself in that lesson? Way ahead of you there, boss. You've given me a lot to think about. I'm gonna be mulling over this whole mess for a couple of days. I'm glad I didn't go back to Harlow. I've got all the family I need right here on our ship.
And then you have Nyoka. Nyoka is this angry, foul-mouthed drunk hunter, and I love her. I mean, she just drinks too much and says some bad stuff, but she's really funny and I enjoy traveling with her. She drinks to numb the pain of the loss of her group of survivalists she was a part of, and that's like the large portion of her character and her quest. Her quest has you tasked with finding these dog tag-like items from the people who died in her group, and to attempt to bury the bodies if you can find them. Also to kill the Manta Queen that was responsible for all of their deaths. And on your journey to try and find everyone from the group, you go to find two members who supposedly are alive on another planet. The two members who had left for a while to go attempt to do a new job and raise some money to get off of Monarch never returned. And when you do find them, well, their corpses anyway, you find out that they never really had any intentions of coming back and helping the others get off of Monarch. This infuriates Nyoka, understandably, as she blames herself and them in part for the deaths of the other members of Charon. Ultimately, after avenging and burying Charon, Nyoka learns to forgive herself and learns what it is to be a part of a team again and to trust others as she travels with you. It's nothing super special, but overall I enjoyed her character and the quest isn't too bad.
I wish these were more auspicious circumstances, but at least we're all here. This bringing them together, burying them. This is the kind of thing Hayes would have done. That makes it stupid. By all accounts, we should have left well enough alone, but that also makes it right. Captain, thank you. You mind if we rest a spell before we head out? I'd like to bury Opal and Clara proper before I lay everyone's medallions to rest.
And then you have Sam, which is a cleaning robot whose cleaning spray has been replaced and retrofitted with an acid sprayer. And that's pretty much it. He just says some weird lines about cleaning and that's all. He's not really that interesting and I never even really traveled with him.
Error! This unit is unable to process the service request. Ah! Customer, please repeat the command.
And overall, I think the companions are really good. They enhance combat and they provide these skills and abilities that kind of augment you, and their interjections during certain conversations adds kind of depth and context to some of the narrative, and some of them are really funny. But the system does lack a lot of complexity, like the game's like Like, it's not like a Dragon Age game where the relationships with the companions like significantly impact the story. But overall, I think they are a good addition to the game. But kind of as with the theme of most of this retrospective, they are a little underbaked, and I feel like you could go a little bit deeper with each one of them and their relationships, and it can be expanded upon. And hopefully the companions in the sequel are equally as interesting, and we can go a little bit deeper into what makes them tick. Now, before I can get to the final act of the game, I've discussed the companions, but there's two other things I need to discuss, and that is the DLCs of the game. The DLCs are the type of DLC that takes place during the narrative and not after it. So before I can fully dive into the finale, I have to go check out what's going on with the DLCs and see what they have in store for me. Now, the first DLC, Murder on Eridanos, showcases the Outer Worlds at its best in my opinion. It's set on a resort sitting on floating chunks of asteroid chained together and piloted by an AI to stay within the thin layer of breathable atmosphere in one of the rings around a gas giant, which is the coolest idea for a setting I have seen in a long time. The story follows your investigation into a murder of a famous actress, Halcyon Helen. The DLC's murder mystery framework provides like this kind of really refreshing change of pace with an emphasis on dialogue and deduction and not super much on the combat, which at this point in the game I'm getting kind of sick of, to be honest with you. So I receive a job offer from one of the leaders of the Rizzo's Corporation on Eridanos to come and investigate the murder of this famous actress who was the spokesperson for Rizzo's, and her murder takes place just mere days before the new color of their vodka was set to release. So I arrive on Eridanos and I begin my investigation. Now I'm tasked with interrogating several suspects and using a special talking gun that can highlight different clues around me and give me information on the clues via dialogue, which I think is a really cool idea, and it was kind of like a cool change of pace. Shockingly, part of my investigation means I have to explore another deadly abandoned corporate laboratory. But in this laboratory, I find out that the new vodka has this parasite in it which is supposed to keep all the workers in the colony happy forever and increase their productivity, but is causing some of them to go crazy and attack people. After investigating several persons of interest and having a few key witnesses actually get killed, presumably by the person who had killed Halcyon Helen, you are ready to present the facts and make an accusation. It does feel a little bit weird that you don't really mention these parasites doing anything for most of your investigation, but that's coming. But as I'm making my accusation, this right here, this part of the game, this one dialogue option, is the hardest that I have ever laughed when playing a video game in my entire life.
I should have stayed back on the ship with Ada.
You know, boss, there are days I wonder how you made it this far without accidentally shooting yourself.
Bold strategy, Captain. Let's see if it works out.
It's astounding you haven't been the death of me, Captain.
Sam says, let your automechanical do the dirty work while you keep your hands clean.
Captain, I humbly stand in awe of your ability to surprise. This is impressive, even for you. And by impressive, I mean astonishingly ludicrous.
I don't understand. What do you mean it was you? That's... I don't have the words to describe how astronomically moronic that is.
Now, unfortunately for this quest, whoever you accuse doesn't really matter, as it's always going to be interrupted by the boss of the corporation being attacked by whoever has been going around and killing the key witnesses and presumably Helen, which is a real shame, because I think having the option to fail this quest would have been really cool. But anyway, as you rush to the rescue, you are confronted with the twist of the investigation, that Halcyon Helen actually had a twin, and she is working to get vengeance on the corporate boss who is responsible for her twin's death, and whose plan was to frame me as the investigator he hired for the death of Halcyon Helen. Now we find out the reason that he had the twin killed was because the twin that he didn't know about, the one that's standing in front of us now, was actually investigating and found out about the parasites and was trying to put a stop to it. He, unfortunately, the leader of Rizzo's, didn't know that it was a twin, so in his attempt to try and kill her before she could leak this information, he killed the twin sister. So now you see where the whole twist comes in. Now here I'm given the option between siding with Halcyon Helen, or her twin anyway, and the corporate boss. And I obviously side with Halcyon Helen because I'm not a terrible person. I then go and I disperse a cure for the parasite infection to prevent it from spreading off of the resort, and then we go and confront the big boss for the final boss fight against this big queen parasite. Now here's the one issue with this boss fight that I do have. The new science weapon introduced here is so unbelievably overpowered, and by using it, I basically trivialized what had the potential of being a really cool boss fight, with actual mechanics that you could leverage and use. In theory, you could run to several different terminals around the boss arena and activate these traps with them, and that would harm the boss, all while dodging all these projectiles that the boss and all these ads it was spawning were shooting at you. But I did not do this. I simply had to empty 2 magazines from this special science weapon that I had found, and that was all she wrote. But overall, I really felt like Murder on Eridanos is The Outer Worlds at its best. Combat takes a backseat to the roleplay, and the writing and humor is on point the entire time, and it's kind of striking that perfect balance of kind of really creepy and dark with the great humor. And I think if the whole game had this kind of vibe and tone, it would be one of the best games that Obsidian had ever made. So it is unfortunate that the second DLC, Peril on Gorgon, is not nearly as good. Honestly, it's very, very average, and the only really cool part about it is that you learn a little bit about Halcyon's history and where the Marauders come from. You see, in this DLC, you're tasked with investigating this abandoned Gorgon facility, Gorgon being this asteroid, where these unethical experiments with new pharmaceuticals for Spacer's Choice led to the creation of the Marauders. So it's cool that you find out where the Marauders come from, but that's really it. You see, one of the things that Peril Gorgon does a little bit better than the base game, in my opinion, is it does encourage a little bit more exploration. They add these audio logs that give a little bit of context and a little bit of lore, if you can find them, and they're spread around the map in little nooks and crannies, and it really makes you slow down and take your time and investigate, and it rewards the exploration a little bit more than the base game does with just the normal junk that you find and different ammo and weapons that you don't need. But basically the story is you're hired to find this woman's mother's journal to, as she puts it, clear her family's name after Spacer's Choice decided to shut down the Gorgon facility and shutter whatever project they were working on. Through your investigation into what happened on the asteroid and searching for the journal, you find out the research into the adrenatime drug was responsible for colonists losing their mind and becoming marauders. You also learn that the mother is in fact alive this whole time, and she's been the one trying to keep people away from the research as to prevent any more casualties and chaos occurring. When you confront the daughter with this information, she does come clean and says that she wants to perfect her mother's research and get back into the good graces with the company and make a name for herself, and you now have to choose whether or not you want to save or destroy the research, side with the daughter or the mother. Now this DLC suffers from a lot of things, but most of all it suffers from really repetitive combat and lack of meaningful side quests. And one of the most annoying things that I experienced on this DLC, since the area is a lot smaller and a lot less open as the layout is a lot more maze-like, you run into the issue of the same enemies respawning statically in the same spot over and over and over again. I mean, I killed the same 4 marauders by this ship maybe 15 times, and it was so boring. And the science weapons that they add aren't all that interesting, and then the binary choice at the end to destroy or preserve the facility's data and side with either the daughter or the mother is typical of the game's moral dilemmas that we've had so far. It has a binary choice with a hidden third option that combines the 2 paths and allows them to work together. It's the exact same formula used in the previous big decisions that you have to make in the game, and it's just so boring. I feel like I could have just completely skipped this DLC and would have been completely fine. And overall, this is just one of the weaker parts of the game to me, and it's only really interesting because of the world building it does as it fleshes out the Marauder faction a bit more. Also, how many damn abandoned secret corporate laboratories am I gonna have to explore in this game? I mean, it's getting a little bit crazy at this point. So with the DLCs wrapped up, it's time for me to return to the main story and begin the final act. So after leaving Monarch, I head to Byzantium to inform Akande that the propaganda is stopped, and as a reward, she lets me in on the big secret that the board has been keeping. This is the same secret that I already learned via the Sublight questline, that there isn't enough food and that the people of the colony are going to starve.
Good afternoon. I'm Chairman Rockwell, and I'm here to address a serious issue facing us. As you all know, our colony has been successful beyond our wildest dreams. Unfortunately, we've recently discovered that our food supply will not be able to sustain Halcyon's population in the long term. Everyone will die. everyone will slowly stop living from malnutrition. But we're doing it together, and that's what matters.
The new information I do receive here is that the board's master plan to solve this is to freeze the colonists in a rotation and have the minimal amount of workers awake required to keep Byzantium life going and the board profitable while they try and solve this issue, while the rest of the colonists are in cryo-freeze on the Hope. Now, typical of the corporations and the board, this is a very not thought out solution, and it's kind of just like the fastest, easiest thing that they can do in this very moment, which is kind of par for the course with the board. The largest issue with this plan, though, is that they too need the chemicals that Phineas is after to put his plan into action, and they also need to kill all the colonists on the Hope to make room for the colonists of Halcyon. Akande then tells me that because of my actions at Edgewater, it will make enacting the plan harder because of the freedom and lack of board control there now after I gave leadership over to Adelaide. If I am to help the board enact this plan, I have to go kill everyone in Edgewater. This is an absolutely crazy thing to ask, and I love the fact that it was asked of me, but I did refuse, as I just didn't really feel like it was something my character would do, because in my head I was only playing both sides as long as I could help mine and Phineas's overall mission be progressed and have kind of information on the board. So, at this point, I didn't feel like the board could help me anymore. When I refused, however, Akande expressed her disappointment by trying to put a bullet between my eyes, and I had to take her and everyone else in the offices out before managing to make my escape from Byzantium and heading back to Phineas with the information about the chemicals. Now, the only problem I do have with this little part is that, yes, while it's cool that she's asking me to eliminate Edgewater and my decision at the beginning of the game is now affecting the final act, I also did completely help the Iconoclasts and MSI team up and basically free themselves from any worry of the board's influence, but she doesn't really seem to care about Monarch or anything that happened there. It's just Edgewater she's worried about. So that's just, it feels a little bit like inconsistent, but it's not that big of a deal. Now, this next part with Phineas, there's nothing really truly revelatory here, as I have already had the big issue of the colony revealed to me, and they wrote the same sort of exposition into this next quest in case you hadn't helped the board out, so I will just quickly skim over what happens. Phineas uses the info from the information broker to find out that the ambassador to Earth has the chemicals and sends me to find out where he's keeping them. The ambassador is on house arrest, we find out, and the chairman of the board has been acting in his name. He doesn't appreciate it and gives me the info about where the gas is. Another secret lab. Go figure. So I break into the lab to get the chemicals, only to find out that they have used the chemicals to freeze a fair few people. And if I were to take all of the chemicals that Phineas needs, the people here will die. So I can either take about 20% of the chemicals and let the people live, but hinder how many Phineas can revive, or I can kill these people and take all the chemicals. I take all the chemicals and I justify it in my head by saying that the colonists on the Hope have a better chance of helping the colony than these colonists here, which is pretty dark and twisted, but it's the decision I made. What I didn't know is that Obsidian was going to absolutely traumatize me for this decision, but hey, I'm here for it. Anyway, I return to Phineas and he tells me that the board is onto us and has taken control of the Hope in order to kill the colonists before we can help them. His idea is to steal the Hope and use its jump drive to jump it to the science station so he can begin reviving the colonists to fight back against the board as soon as possible. So, I head to the Hope, infiltrate the control system, and proceed to jump the ship directly into the sun. Oh, wait. I love being dumb in this game. So after reloading, I jump the ship back to Phineas, only to find out that he's been captured by the board and the final mission of the game is here. The final mission takes you to Tartarus, a high security prison where the board's leaders are holding Phineas Wells. The actual gameplay of Tartarus is very underwhelming. At this point, I am so overpowered that it's not difficult at all. It's also really short, like 20 minutes from beginning to end. I do, however, enjoy seeing the factions that you helped show up to help out, even if I didn't need it. I fight my way through the prison, and when the director of the board finally confronts me, it's here that I have a chance to make my final decision on who I want to side with. But, having failed to finish the board's quest line and killing Akande, I lock myself out of siding with the board, which is fine. I wanted to work with Phineas the whole time anyway. The director then sets up the final boss fight. And before I show you this, I want to remind you that I am playing on the absolute hardest difficulty you can play on in this game, okay? It does not get any harder than this right here. So yeah, the final mission was kind of anticlimactic, to be honest. I guess it's fine, but it had a lot more potential on paper in my opinion, just like most of this game. So I save Phineas and the slideshow begins telling me about the consequences of all my choices. Adelaide grows Edgewater into a little gardening paradise, but one thing that I wasn't expecting is that she does kick anyone out who sympathizes with Thompson, which is kind of crazy and not a development I was expecting, but it is what it is. MSI and the Iconoclasts work together to make MSI and Monarch a powerhouse in the colony, with worker reforms for better lives for the employees. Byzantium is no longer the paradise built on the backs of colonists it once was, and the inhabitants even have to get jobs now. Shocking. The remaining companies on the board struggle to maintain power, and freedom blossoms across Halcyon. Phineas revives the best and brightest from the Hope, and they get to work to fix the food issue. Eventually, they solve it, and everything turns out hunky-dory for the most part. This is definitely the good ending, quote-unquote, of the game, and the ending it feels like the player is being pushed towards by the developers. But there are other endings that you can get where the colony fails or the board enacts its plans. Or, and this is something I really do appreciate about Obsidian and this game, the genocide ending. You see, one thing that I haven't mentioned because not a large portion of the player base would even play like this, but none of the NPCs in this game are essential. You can literally kill everyone in the game and still complete it. I know that must have been such a pain to enact for such a small percentage of the player base, but the fact that the developers and Obsidian did this shows to me that they really do care about player freedom to solve problems how they see fit, and I just love that they did that. They did not need to include that, and they did, and I'm just giving them their props and their shout out right now. Okay, so if you're still with me, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. The Outer Worlds is a good game with so much potential, but more often than not, it really fails to live up to the potential it continuously shows. While it has good world building, some sharp writing, and some memorable characters, it really never fully knocks your socks off like you would expect. As I said in the beginning of the video, I felt as though this game deserves to be judged on its own merit, and that's what I tried to do throughout this retrospective. But to me, even though I didn't voice them, the comparisons to New Vegas happened, and I feel like they were inevitable. And ultimately, this led to expectations that the game just couldn't meet. And this is why I think the reception has soured a bit for some folks, but to me, if you eliminate the comparisons, you have an okay game with a lot of potential. And I won't lie, I'm hopeful because despite its flaws, The Outer Worlds serves as a strong foundation for a potential sequel. Well, not potential anymore. But by refining its mechanics and embracing deeper role-playing systems and crafting more impactful choices, the franchise could achieve its full potential. But as it stands, The Outer Worlds is an enjoyable, if flawed experience that offers a glimpse of what could be a launchpad for something much greater.